Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is June 7th, 2019, and my guest is writer-photographer, former Wall Street trader, and author Chris Arnade. Chris was a guest on EconTalk in October of 2016, talking about the Mexican financial crisis. Today we're talking about his new book, Dignity, Seeking Respect in Back Row America. Chris, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thank you for having me.
I want to let parents listening with children know that this episode will almost certainly touch on a number of adult themes, so you may want to screen it before listening with your children. Chris, you've written a very powerful book that I think has a chance to spark a national conversation about the people who are not part of the progress that we've seen in America over the last few decades, people who sometimes are described as left behind. You describe them as people in the back row. How did you come to the experiences that you chronicle in the book?
Kind of in a backhanded way. I mean, I didn't really intend this to ever be a book. Didn't ever really intend this to be more than just kind of, I guess, a guy with a camera kind of exploring the neighborhoods he was told not to go to. As you mentioned, and as we spoke about in the last podcast, I was a Wall Street trader for 20 years. And before that, I had a PhD in physics and come to the industry that way. And one of the things I did was to take long walks, often 20 miles walks, and just explore the neighborhoods of New York. And those walks started to shift following the financial crisis, when I kind of realized that my industry and myself and a lot of people like me had really messed up and screwed up, and to reevaluate kind of how I saw things and how I thought about things and how I learned things. In particular, this kind of sitting behind a wall of computers, kind of making decisions based on flashing numbers and PowerPoint presentations and Excel spreadsheets was missing, a voice, and missing the actual people, we were making decisions about. So I went, I kind of said, to myself, I've been doing this quantitative database approach to life so long. Let me just talk to people. And those walks provided me that opportunity, because when you have a camera, people open up. And so those walks evolved into kind of me kind of just going on a listening tour, I guess. And one of those walks led me to the Bronx, which led me to the South Bronx, a neighborhood in the South Bronx I had been told not to go to, because the data said it had all sorts of problems. And so when I walked into that neighborhood, I saw what the data didn't show, which was a thriving community with a lot of beauty. There was a lot of frustration there, but the people were doing their best to make it a functional neighborhood.
But a lot of the people you met there were people that those of us who have not been to that neighborhood would not describe necessarily as successful. They're drug addicts, drug users, prostitutes, a lot of homeless people, correct?
That's correct. That wasn't my initial focus, but that's what my focus became. As I spent more time there, and I realized that not only was this neighborhood stigmatized unfairly in my mind, but within that neighborhood was another community that was stigmatized even more, and that was those who were suffering from addiction, or sex workers, or those who were living on the streets. Those all three go basically hand in hand. So I shifted my focus more towards that. Initially out of kind of curiosity, but then it became somewhat political, I would say, in the sense that what I was seeing amongst this population and was like what I was seeing in this neighborhood was people who were stigmatized, what I thought unfairly, and the kind of stereotypes that we were using to stigmatize them were just that, stereotypes that were wrong.
What drew you to that to that neighborhood, do you think?
Part of it is that, I mean, there's some simple things. One is it's really like a small town. I think a lot of big cities are really just collections of small towns that adjoin against each other. And this one in particular is Hunts Point. Because of the geographical location, it's basically in a walled community. It's isolated on three sides by it's like a tongue of land that juts out into the East River, right across from LaGuardia, with Rikers in between. It's a tongue of land that sticks out, and so on three sides it's surrounded by water, and on the fourth side, where it attaches to the Bronx, there is a pretty engineered road, elevated road, the Bruckner, which I believe is 6 lanes, and it's just brutal, and it effectively cuts the neighborhood off from the rest of the Bronx. So in that sense, it's a very knowable place. It's 35,000 residents. You know, I like to say that New York City puts whatever it doesn't want there. It puts junkyards and industrial plants and other things that it doesn't particularly want. So the neighborhood has a lot going against it in that sense. But it's also 35,000 people who make it a real community, and that's that community, the knowability, the community, and then also just as a photographer, the light. It's south facing, so it gets good light, which makes for strong photos.
So you started going down there occasionally, and then you started going down there every day, all the time, pretty much, correct?
Correct. It ended up being basically 3 years of being there, 7 hours a day, 3 hours a day, 8 hours a day, 4, depending on the situation. And that required me basically quitting my job at some point, or they quit me. So when the buyout opportunity came, I accepted it. And again, it wasn't really clear what I was going to focus full time on this. I still was thinking about maybe trying to find another job in a hedge fund or something, but it just kind of took over my life, and I felt more and more distance from what I had been doing. And so I shifted into this process of, I guess, documenting what I saw, although it became more than that. It became getting involved in some of the lives of some of the people, trying to help them, taking the detox, visiting in Rikers, taking them to the hospital, things like that.
Talk about letting them use your cell phone, your computer. This is a personal question. If you don't want to answer, I'll edit it out. But did you tell your friends and family that you were doing this every day? And if so, what did they must have been in some dimension taken aback or surprised? When I described the book to people, some people look at me puzzled, like, why would he do that? You must have gotten that reaction, or they must have been afraid for you. And I assumed there were times you were afraid.
There wasn't many times I was afraid, to be honest. I think one of the misconceptions is about the danger in these neighborhoods. But, there were people who thought maybe I was off my rocker. But I was supported by my family who, I wasn't a traditional Wall Street trader. I came from an academic background. And my parents were academics. So I think in some senses, I think I'm the only person from my college to have ever gone to Wall Street, which was a very leftist college. So I think in some senses, people who knew me all my life would say that me being on Wall Street was more of the anomaly.
So after you did this for 3 years in the Bronx, you decided you wanted to look at a wider swath of people struggling and the communities that you were interested in. So tell me what you did driving across America to continue this odyssey.
Yeah, I basically, to put my old mathematics hats on, I wanted to see if what I learned in Hunts Point in the Bronx, South Bronx, was translationally invariant. Was it true? Was it true elsewhere? So I started finding neighborhoods that, were stigmatized or forgotten or left behind, whatever term you want to use. They all are unfortunately demeaning. That's the problem with these terms, is that they quickly become demeaning. So I found places, across the country that I thought kind of represented a fair, that kind of would test my theories, that were different from Hunts Point, but similar in some ways, and to see how stuff held up. So I think I ended up doing 2 years on the road. I mean, I came back a lot. I spent a lot of time back at home, but I go on these trips of maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a week, 6 weeks, 2 months, depending on where my kind of destination was, and just go to communities that, where a lot of people live, but we rarely hear from, and also generally have a bad reputation.
But the other part that I think these areas have in common is there's not a lot of employment. There's not a lot of whatever employment was there has gone. Factories have closed. So you're looking at places that used to be somewhat thriving and are now desperately poor in the financial monetary sense. And the people generally are not working in a lot of the people are not working in traditional 9-to-5 jobs. Would that be an accurate way to summarize the sort of economic environment, the climate that they were in?
Right. I think, but in some of the neighborhoods were not far from successful neighborhoods. So South Bronx is very close to Wall Street, very close to the Upper West Side. So it wasn't just economic. I think they were neighborhoods within a larger community that was doing well, but had been stigmatized in many cases by racism. But yes, I think the majority of them were places that had lost jobs, or I think it almost became weren't close to an elite educational institution. I think that almost became the more defining feature of them. They weren't attached either in employment or reputation to a high-end college.
You say they were stigmatized, and I hope come back and talk about that. But there's some objective aspects of these communities that are not related to stigma. There's often boarded up buildings. There are, when I say not related to stigma, that meaning there's some visible things that are not going well in these neighborhoods. Drug use, boarded up buildings, lack of steady work for most of the people, often people struggling in very ennobling, noble is not the right word. I don't know what, but there's a courage about some of the people you chronicle that's very apparent. But these are neighborhoods that are not on the surface doing well, at least.
That's correct. I mean, I almost feel like I used to say you could put a blindfold on me and drop me someplace in the United States, and I can tell you within 3 minutes what type of, where, if it's one of those neighborhoods. I can tell you maybe in 1 minute. You can put me in the grocery store, in the aisle, and I can tell you pretty quickly. And it's not by looking at the people; it's by the products that are being sold, by how fresh the vegetables are. It's by how much engineering, traffic engineering is there. It's these places don't have a lot of work put into them, and a lot has falling apart, or the work that's been put into them is kind of decaying and wasn't the right fit. So you can tell immediately, very quickly. And again, not looking at the people at all.
But your book has dozens of color photographs. It's a strange book in the sense that in many ways it's a portrait of, I think, people living, some subset of the people you talk to are, I would say, living a life of desperation. But it's also kind of a coffee table book. It's a pretty book, but it's very powerful. It's in many ways, I guess, a better way to desperation is related to, I guess, at the root of it, to despair. There's a lot of despair in the book, and yet there's also a lot of dignity and lack of dignity. It's a powerful book. Let's talk about the role McDonald's plays in these communities and how you came to see that and the time you spent there and what that's like.
Right. I ended up spending a lot of time, and a lot of the book is focused on McDonald's, because that's where in these neighborhoods, that was one of the few institutions that, for lack of the better word, worked. A place where, you could go into one of these neighborhoods, and perhaps on a Wednesday night, the sole thing that was kind of open and fully knowable and safe and functional was McDonald's. And the community used it as almost their town center. It's where people got together to meet. It's where, if people play bingo, people play chess, people play checkers, people play bingo. Chess clubs meet there. And the thing was, when my focus was primarily on homeless and addicted, that's also he uses McDonald's. I kind of realized that in the South Bronx, where certainly McDonald's is central to the life of somebody who's on the streets. It's a place where they can go in and just escape the streets for a few hours and the elements of the streets, and clean up in the bathroom, maybe shoot up in the bathroom.
It's warm.
But also, free Wi-Fi, charge your phone. But also the big thing, I feel the more important thing was it's almost a no judgment zone. They can sit there and be left alone or interact with people on the terms of polite, I call it polite society, normal society, and not be stared at. One of the things that frustrates me is as much as I love academics, I got a PhD, but if a homeless person or an addict goes onto a college campus, they're going to have the police called on them. If they walk into McDonald's, they're able to sit there, for a few hours.
I could imagine it would go the other way, but it doesn't.
Right, and so it's just this place that becomes. I basically saw McDonald's in a very different light. I am on the left, and so I am frustrated with McDonald's on many levels, but the reality for the working class and the very poor is that McDonald's is essential. It's cheap food, and I don't mean cheap. I mean it's inexpensive food that's pretty good, and so it's if you're on a tight budget and you don't have much money and you don't have much time, McDonald's is essential. But it's more than that. It's the community that evolves there. And I think it's just really important to realize, what I kind of started learning was, one of these things you learn when you talk to people and visualize and get away from data is that how important people need a community. They need it so much that they form it in an institution that's designed to be entirely transactional. Like that's how much they want it. They want community that much. And socializing. And so the social activity of McDonald's really struck me, and it became kind of in many ways a light that went off in my head and said, I've been thinking about things so wrong.
Before we get into some of the other ideas and impressions that you've gathered from these experiences, give us a little bit of the flavor of how you would talk to people on the street. You're walking around, you're a white guy, often in a black neighborhood or a non-white neighborhood. You've got a camera. You stick out. How did you get people to open up to you? Literally, what did you say to them? What did they say to you? How did you answer their questions? You give some examples in the book, so share those, please.
In general, my overall approach is what I tell this to people is, and I really believe this isn't a gimmick. Is just have no fear. Don't be reckless, but the rule I always use is, be confident without being arrogant. And also be there for the right reasons. If you are there with good intentions and you show that you trust people, and I do, then I find that that's reciprocated, that people trust you. The other thing is one of my biggest frustrations is people are scared of these neighborhoods, and there's really not a good reason to be scared of them. I mean, I'll put my old math hat on again and say, if a neighborhood is bad, so it's supposed to be crime-ridden, in a good neighborhood, let's say 99% of people are playing by the rules or not criminals. In a bad neighborhood, it's 94% of the people, 93. The point is the overwhelming bulk of people are still well-intended people. Yeah. And so, focus on those 95%. People are tired of being stigmatized in these neighborhoods. So if you come in with good intentions, people pick that up. In terms of how I approached it, was just generally walking around, and again, because so much of the book takes place in minority neighborhoods, and I'm very white. People would often approach me and just out of curiosity. Yeah. And so that would start a dialogue. And one of the things I would go wherever anybody asked me to go. I think a lot of people might have think that was naive of me, but I remember, one case where I was in a neighborhood in the probably one of the most high quote crime rated neighborhoods in New York City. And a gentleman who was clearly on drugs was really excited to see my camera, and he wanted me to come with him to go into an abandoned building that we had to climb, basically a few rickety ladders that he constructed so he could live on the top floor. He said he wanted to show me something, and it was 6 p.m. and the light was dimming, and a lot of things told me I probably shouldn't go, but I did. And what he had showed me was he was a painter, and he had done a painting. He wanted to show me the painting, and so there were a lot of moments like that where I trusted people. Now there's a big difference here. I'm a male. Yeah. I think if females would have a much different circumstance, and I recognize that. I don't want to sound naive about that, but another thing I would do is if I saw that somebody wasn't trusting me. Let's say I meet a group of people in McDonald's who, are used to being seen as criminals, or are homeless and are used to being kind of stereotyped. What I'll do is I'll hand them my camera and say, "Oh, excuse me, I have to go back to my car to get something. Will you watch my camera?" And leave for 5 minutes and come back with having left them my camera. The implicit message is explicit is I trust you. Yeah. And every time it came back, the camera was there. So it was my way of saying, like, here's a $3,000 object. Here's $3,000. I'm going to go watch it for me. I think I just feel it gets me frustrated when there was a time when I was in Milwaukee, and I had been there. It was the second week of being there, and I had spent all my time in a very traditional black neighborhood, north side. And one of the things that's really wonderful about Milwaukee, the black community in Milwaukee, is it's directly from Mississippi, because almost everybody came in the 40s and 50s, and they came from the same part of Mississippi. So it's like this small southern town that's mixed with a northern town, and so they have a lot of bars, unlike in a lot of other poor neighborhoods, black community. There's bars that it's kind of the Wisconsin bar culture mixed with Mississippi. And so I was saying to some acquaintances I knew in Mississippi who are on the political left like me and are white, I don't drink anymore, but I still go to the bars to have like a soda or a Pepsi just to talk to people. And I said, hey, if you guys want to go out tonight, I'm going to I think it was a Catfish Lounge. And they're like, I don't know, man. I think you'll get stabbed there. And I was like, I walked in and no one ever stabbed me. No one even thought about it. I got some odd looks initially when a white guy walks into all black Catfish bar, but by the end of the night, everybody was opening up and talking to me. And, they were just happy to have someone come in and not be worried about getting stabbed. So I think you just got to be a little more open-minded about reaching out to other people.
Through this experience, actually, let's start with. Let me ask you about the metaphor that you use of the front row and the back row, and your emphasis on credentials. One way you put it is that you understood from a young age that if you went off to college and did the right thing, you'd escape your small town that you grew up in Florida. Certainly in my circles, everyone is deeply overly focused on their children getting into the best schools and see that somewhat correctly, maybe not, but somewhat correctly, as the road to the financial well-being. And the populations you're interacting with in this book, they don't have good access to that credential machine. If they get access to it, they don't know the rules of the game, so they struggle to thrive in it. Talk about that culture that we live in, you and I live in, and they don't.
Right. I kind of use the metaphor of the back row and the front row. I think we've built this kind of as our we can talk about it later, but as our economy has shifted into kind of a more focused post-industrial kind of knowledge-based economy, yep. the access to that is along this very narrow path that weaves through these certain institutions, and the gain from that is huge. The difference between, the gap between getting an education and not is growing. But my biggest frustration is not only that's bad. I think we should have kind of different ideas about success instead of it's just one institutions. But I think a lot of people don't understand how narrow that path is and how you have to really start at an early age and do all the right things. I liken it to like an escalator that goes up really, really fast. And if you don't get on, you kind of fall behind or you get flung off. Part of it's just that narrow path requires you to know things and to be aware of it. And a lot of people aren't aware of it. They don't know anything about it. They don't know the availability. They don't know all the unwritten rules. The other thing is I don't think a lot of people necessarily want that. It's just not who they are. It's not their thing, and one of the things I think about a lot is the stories of kids, teenagers or young adults in my book who couldn't go away to the elite institutions, even if they could cobble together the credentials by high school, the resume by high school to do that because of family obligations. There's the young woman in East LA who needs to stay in East LA and go to the local community college instead of a more credentialed school because she's her mom's translator. Her mom's Mexican American first generation, and like in many families like that, the oldest child, in this case the daughter, is the one who kind of deals with both languages. Or the young boy, African American boy in Reno, Nevada, who couldn't leave because his mom is dependent on him for her sobriety. She needs the stability of him. She's now, like 5 years. She's been sober for 5 years, and so him and his brother feel they need to stay to be there with her, and they want to be there with her. So I think, what we ask of people to succeed requires a lot more support than we recognize, a lot more information than we recognize, a lot more understanding of rules that aren't written than we recognize, but it also requires wanting this concept, this very narrowly defined concept of how to live and what's important. I say within the African American community, the term, acting white captures some of that, but I think the broader term is acting front row. You have to behave and think in a certain way to succeed through these institutions. And that's not for everybody.
Let's talk about the options available to some of these folks. And of course, you're getting a very, quote, biased sample. It's not, that doesn't mean it's irrelevant. It just, you're not seeing the people who chose to leave, but the ones who stay, either because they don't want to leave, because they like some aspect of this life, or they can't imagine or know where that path is that could take them out. One of the issues we talk about a lot on the program is the idea that it's gotten harder to leave in America because the way we've zoned and regulated land use in American cities has driven up rents quite a bit. So a person from rural Ohio, West Virginia, California, you were in Bakersfield, if you want to move to where there's more opportunity, it's a lot more expensive to get there and stay there. But you point out, and I think this is hard for us to imagine who are in the front row and had a certain life experience. A lot of the folks that you talk to, they don't want to leave. They're happy where they are. They can't imagine leaving. And they're living in places that that people in the front row would struggle to find bearable, but they're happy in an emotional sense. They may have some material struggles, but they don't feel they could live anywhere else.
Right. I think it gets to a larger point that the thing we in the front row really only value things we can measure. I call them kind of economic metrics, things that, so you can't really put the value on the emotional attachment to place. And so we tend to dismiss it or ignore it or belittle it, when in fact, it's one of the few things we gift to people. It doesn't require credentials to have that. It just requires being born there. And so, all those what I call non-credentialed forms of meaning, things that are just kind of no barriers to entry, like place, other than what it comes from birth, like place, like family, like faith. We tend to dismiss, I think not necessarily just because we don't believe them, but because we can't measure them. We can't really put our hands in grasp, like, what's the importance of knowing that your family's been here 3 generations and they've all looked at the same hills and they've all walked up the same paths. And, I think there's a lot of value in that. And a lot of people appreciate that and get a lot out of that. But I think we tend to ignore that value simply because we don't know how to think about it.
So I'm going to read an excerpt from the book. Which you write, I was part of a global group of lawyers, bankers, business people, and professors who are their profession first and a New Yorker, Brit, or Southerner second. They were as comfortable in New York City as they are in London or Paris or Sao Paulo or Hong Kong. Well, in the right neighborhoods in each. In their minds, staying put is a mistake. If you stay, you limit your career, you limit your wealth, and you limit your intellectual growth. They also don't fully understand the value of place because, like religion, it's hard to measure. What's the value of staying near the family that raised you or in the valley where you were born? Had I asked those in my hometown when I visited why they stayed, why they were still there, I would have gotten the answer I heard from Cairo to Amarillo to rural Ohio. They would have looked at me like I was crazy, then said, because it is my home. It's an answer that is obvious because there is value in home, but it isn't just the value of the house or the yard. It's the connections, networks, friends, family, congregation, the Little League team, the usuals at the hairdresser, regulars at the bar, the union hall, the crew at the vape store, the regulars at the half-price movie night, the guys for Tuesday night basketball. The front row doesn't fully get that because they don't see that value. And like me, they moved before, and they'll probably move again. We have broken our connections and built new ones. If we can do it, so can anyone else, we think. And then later you write, you're talking to someone, and you say, ask him the question I already know the answer to. Why have you stayed here? He shoots back without any pause. Too many ties here, and it's as good a place as you can find. Do you like it here? Hell, I was born here. Have to like it. It is home. And I think you really, end a quote, I think, you nailed something there that I moved 6 or 7 times before I was 8 years old. My high school years were spent outside of Boston and Lexington, Massachusetts, but we moved when I was a junior to Israel, thinking we were going to stay there. My dad's company sent him there. We thought we were going to be there for a few years. That was just normal for me. I didn't think anything of moving. I didn't have a place that I would call home, except for maybe Memphis, where I was born, but never really lived, where I had a lot of family. And I think that sense of home for people like me, often highly educated, it is a bit alien for us. And you really, you capture the problem I think some of us have. I've said many times on this program that the problem of poverty is luggage. The people need to get out. And a lot of them don't want to. And that's hard for us to understand.
Right. It was hard for me to understand. I mean, again, even though I come from a small town, we were the outsiders in our small town. My dad was a German who had escaped Germany before the war. He was a professor in a town that didn't have any other professors or just a few others. And so for me, moving was easy. It was never really my home, even though I had strong connections and appreciated my town. But So I did I leaped from there to college, to grad school, to New York. And then when I was in New York, I, was traveling all over the world. So, I would have been a very different guest 20 years before. What I would have basically said, just move, and, I should have seen it because I went home pretty regularly when my parents were alive, and just seeing that this was what people wanted. But you're blind to things you don't want to necessarily think about, or it's a hard thing to come to realize. But I think, again, we just don't understand the value of place. And one of the things that frustrates me is if you're on the left like I am, you're supposed to, in my mind at least, you're supposed to focus on the working poor and respect them as much as you respect yourself and their views. And asking them to move is taking away one of the few pieces of capital they have, or devaluing it. Again, it's something that's gifted to them at birth, and so you're asking to you're saying that piece of capital has no value, which is very elitist. But I would also say, at a more pragmatic level, I can put my old Wall Street hat on and say, you're also asking people to sell an asset into probably all-time lows, and so you're asking them to take that luggage and sell it often, and in a market that might have crashed, right? Or so that's you're asking them to cash out at a low. So look, I think I don't want to give the impression that a lot of people, are that provincial in the sense, but I mean, there are people you can go to one of these towns and a guy will have lived there all his life, but he'll also jump in his truck and go work for a month up in North Dakota if there's a job, right? But he'll come back and he won't move his family. Or a woman will, I was in Preston, in a small town in Kentucky, where I didn't see any black people except for one, and she was a nurse who had come from Cleveland to work in the hospital for 6 months and was staying in a hotel. So people do move for temporary employment, but in general, there's a lot of value to place.
So I want to share the tension in my views on this issue of place and economic change in particular, which is in the background. So we allow trade mostly in the United States, free trade. We also allow internal trade. We allow technological change, innovation that replaces workers with robots and machines and computers. And that leads to a steady rising standard of living for a lot of people, not every single person at any one moment, of course, but over generations. It's why we're multiple times better off materially than people lived 100 years ago. But that transition, of course, is hard on certain groups. It was hard on farmers when we innovated in the farm and changed what size of farm was going to be successful, which meant small farmers basically couldn't persist anymore, couldn't pay their loans. Their kids couldn't then become farmers. There's all kinds of non-material, non-measurable effects of these changes. A factory closes, and the opportunities that are created when that factory closes are not in that town anymore. That's pretty obvious and visible. What's harder to see are the opportunities that are created elsewhere for the next generation. So I'm going to give a negative view of your book story and then a positive view, and then I want to let you react. So my negative view, which would be in line with, I would say, the theme of the book, is that by having in place economic policies that allow factories to close, move to Mexico, or become more efficient and hire fewer people, become bigger elsewhere in another location, and this town, which used to be centered around the factory for people who don't have a lot of education to work at. So it's gone, and that means that the social ties that exist in this town start to crumble and tear and disappear, and then the drugs come, and people have very hard time. That's the negative story, and your book's a portrait of that despair in the aftermath of some of these economic changes. The positive story would be, sure, the town does badly, but because we have more resources, because we've tried to be more effective and allow people to buy things that are less expensive because of trade or technology lowering the costs, new opportunities expand elsewhere. And we don't see those. They're happening outside the town. And we don't see the kids in that town who leave, who realize this is not where opportunity is anymore. It's somewhere else. And it's much better elsewhere than it was before as a result of the economic change that we set in motion. And so when we visit the town, which is what you did, what we see are two things. The people who either can't pursue the opportunities elsewhere because they're too old, their training, their skills, their education can't set them on that path, or the people who really love where they grew up, those social experiences you've been poetically and beautifully describing, so they stay. And so how should I think about those two stories? I mean, I think they're both true. I don't think one's true and one's false. I think they're both true. But I think in policy circles, people, and because of the politics, people respond to that with, policy proposals that are very different. So how do you think about those two stories?
I think they're both true as well. I think that the issue, I guess I would say, is I don't have a good part of what I don't do in my book is I don't give policies because because of the ambiguity of what you just asked. Basically, I don't know how to solve the issue. What I would say is where I think I would differ from you in that description is what has been lost. Two things. One is what has been lost is, I think, I used to say when I kind of my cartoon summary of how I think about free trade is kind of the world we moved into. We look at a spreadsheet. We say, okay, net. Here's the winning. Here's a winning column. Here's a losing column. Add them up. It's a positive. Let's do it. Right. As long as it's positive. If it's negative, let's not do it. I think what I've been trying to say in my book is you're not capturing all the losses. And I think what you're pushing back is you're not capturing all the gains either. I think to my point of you're not capturing all the losses, when that factory leaves and those jobs leave and those young kids who go off to college leave, it leaves a vacuum in the center where it's not just jobs that are lost, but it's families that are taken apart. It's stability that is thrown out the window. It's communities that are emptied of resources and into that vacuum comes drugs and dysfunction and despair, which is why I think you see the unhappiness, and it's why you see the spike in suicides, which is just alone is the statistics that should give everybody pause.
Oh, I agree.
But I would say the other thing I would mention is when I went to it didn't make it into the book. I went to Lumberton, North Carolina, which is it's Robeson County, the poorest county in North Carolina. And I went there partly because A, it was a poorest county, but B, it's one of the most unique places in the United States where it's about as diverse as you're going to get. It's 1/3 African American, 1/3 white, and 1/3 Native American, the Lumbee Indians. And they've lost a lot. And when I go to town, I go to the community college. And I went to the community college in Robeson. It was the summer, so the college was out of session, but a magnet high school was just finishing up. And that magnet high school had taken the smartest, most talented kids in Robeson County, extracted them from the rest of the high school thing, and given them at the end, they graduated with a junior college degree as well as a college degree, as well as a high school degree. And I sat with about 20 of these kids. And it was it was all across the spectrum. It was almost all working class, kids from working class families, a third black, a third white, a third Native American. It's just wonderful, wonderful kids. And to a person, none of them was going to come back.
Oh, yeah.
And, I'm not faulting them. I was that kid.
Yeah.
I wish I would. And I am, you talk about the winners. Well, they're the ones who are going to win from this new calculation. And good for them. I don't want to tell them they need to come back to Robeson County and do something they don't want to do. They want to go out and have a life that includes travel, a life that
in the universe.
Yeah, and they're all wonderful kids. But I, however, know that had one fifth of them come back to Robeson, they would have changed Robeson for the better. So I don't know how you change that. I don't think you need to have these 20 kids be forced, be scolded or back into coming home. I just think the problem is we have the difference between those kids. The solution, if it lies, is the difference between these kids who leave and the difference between these kids who stay. The reward shouldn't be, the difference in reward shouldn't be as great. You shouldn't be economically rewarded 25 times more if you leave than if you stay. I think that's part of the problem. I would also say that the sense of inevitability that we just all tend to throw up our hands and say, well, we can't do anything about this. It's just the way the world goes. I'm not so sure that's entirely true. I think that we've generally accepted as a culture or emphasized economic growth as our primary motive and done anything and everything to promote it. One of the kind of there's a small community near my home. I don't know if you ever heard of the Bruderhofs. They're basically anti-Baptist Marxist. They are communal society. They're a commune that's built around the Bible. They were kicked out of Nazi Germany, and they resettled in the United States. In any case, the way they have communal living, they don't own possessions, but the way they make their money is they have a factory. They make children's furniture and furniture for the handicapped. And I had visited the Bruderhof community because they live near me, and they invite anybody to come visit. And one of the things that was fascinating about their factory was they actually took technology out of the factory. They have a part of the factory where they manufacture that they had automated, and they removed the automation so that the elder members of the community would have a role in the factory, which I thought was a really interesting, they found that it gave a greater sense of health of the community as a whole because everybody had a role in production. I mean, I think we in many ways have green-lighted change so that it goes forward at an immensely fast pace. And the other thing I would say is I think we think a lot about change. Change is good. It is, but I don't think we often think about the pace of change, that humans can only accept so much over such a short period of time, and that the first derivative of that change matters a lot, and it wouldn't be a great we might have a healthier country in aggregate if we slow down the pace of change to let things kind of catch up, to let the kind of communities catch up to that pace of change.
Yeah, that's the challenge. And we're going to come back and talk about this issue of measurability and the emphasis on growth, because I've come to agree with that view, even though I'm still a free market person. I do think our culture and our policies have taken a turn for the worse because of our focus on what is measurable. So, I echo that theme in your book myself, and I'm very sympathetic to it. The challenge is how to get there from here. It's one thing to say, 3% growth, 4% growth, we don't need that. 2.6 would be great. But there isn't a dial. You can't just say, well, accept a little less growth and in return for more opportunity for people to react to it. And instead we go sort of case by case, and we say, for example, we could say, we should ban autonomous vehicles. We shouldn't allow them on the roads because they're going to put 3 million, 4 million, whatever it is, cab drivers and truck drivers out of work potentially, assuming we solve the technological problems. Let's say we do. And that's going to be very destructive. It's going to happen overnight, maybe, very quickly. It's happening right now, maybe. And those people are going to struggle to find work. And it's true that in the long run, they're going to turn out fine. Their kids will have better opportunity, which is the upside of my story as a free marketer. I agree with you that the narrow calculus, well, if the benefits outweigh the cost, let's do it. That's in economics called Pareto efficiency, more or less. And I think that's immoral. I reject that utilitarian calculus. I don't think that's the reason to be in favor of economic freedom and allow economic change. I think there are human reasons, not just the net gain in monetary terms to what you can, to the people and within the borders. But, the idea that we can sort of have a less free market system or we have a little less change by dialing back some knob, I think is a little bit it's a dangerous fantasy. It's going to encourage people's ability to do some very unpalatable things. So I think the challenge is, given that I'm not on the left, but I'm sympathetic to these costs, what kind of ways are there to deal with it? And unfortunately, to my view, and I suspect to yours, the standard view is, we'll just give them money for a while. And we had a guest, Jake Vigdor, on the program talking about the minimum wage, where a political operative said, yeah, it's sure there are going to be a lot of unemployed people because of the living wage in Seattle, but it doesn't matter. They're going to be unemployed anyway soon because of technology. So what's the difference? They're going to have to get a check anyway. So let's give it to them now. And I think that just shows a total lack of what gives people's lives meaning and makes their hearts sing and makes them feel important and dignified and lovely and loved. And I think that whole mindset, which is just as prevalent on the left and the right, which shocks me the more I think about it, just not the way to get there from here. It's not the way to solve's not the right word. It's not the way to cope with this pace of change. And I don't think we have a good answer, but I think a lot of the answers that are on the table now are desperately wrong.
Yeah, part of the reason I stay away from policy solutions is I don't know. I think the problems are too deep. As I say, it's kind of like, I think the core problem is it's not just we've made everything about the economic. The only forms of meaning that are economic, and we've forgotten. We've become hyper utilitarian, to use your language. Is that people want to feel, at their core, people want to feel a valued member of something larger than themselves, and a free market-based economy does that for maybe the top 5%. Because I can tell you on Wall Street, nobody is happy with their pay, even if they get paid a lot. They always look at the person next to them and say, they got a lot more than me.
That's going to be a tough standard to overcome. The people who are happy with their lot. I like to quote the Talmud. It says, who is rich? The person that's happy with their lot. That's a rare person.
That's right. But I think I guess I would answer your question in another way, which is I happen to believe that you have to do income in distribution for the short term because, I think it's morally right, and I think we argue too much about utility. You mentioned, why do we always have to put things on a more utilitarian basis? I happen to think we feel the need to always support every argument with data when I think a lot of the arguments are better just supported by, this is morally right. That's my view on immigration. I agree. It's the morally right thing to do. End of story. I don't need statistics about violence or whatever to support this.
Yeah.
But getting back to this question, what I feel that free healthcare is morally right. I think income distribution is morally right. However, if I were a libertarian or free market person, and I was talking to bankers in a very self-interest way, what I would tell them is, I'd put it in my math and my finance terms, you guys need to buy an out of the money put. Meaning, if you do not do something against your philosophy, against your free market philosophy, you're going to have a riot on your hands and you're going to die. Not official, not you're not going to be killed, but you're going to have a political environment that's going to overthrow you and replace you with something much worse. So you may not it may go against your ideology to do the following 8 things, but in your own self-interest, you better do them, because if you don't and things continue to progress the way they do, that vacuum I talk about being there, into that vacuum can come ugly politics.
Oh yeah.
And I view that as kind of like, I agree with you that I don't know the solutions independent of the politics. Beyond, I wish the world in aggregate focused less on material things, and we could think about non-material things and providing people meaning that way. But at a pragmatic level, if something doesn't happen soon, it's going to be ugly.
So I disagree with you on a couple of counts there. Let me push back a little bit, which is that, we do redistribute a non-zero amount of money in the United States. We do have a safety net. The countries that have more generous ones, I'm not sure they have a sustainable path. A world of free healthcare might be moral, but if it's lousy healthcare, we're not going to like it. And I know there are arguments that say, it's just as good if it's free. I think that's complicated, but it's not our topic today. But I just want to suggest that the quote short-run solutions, which either side is pushing, I think are not going to solve this core problem very well. Certainly don't want people starving in the streets. But this loss of meaning, this loss of connectedness, the loss of dignity, which is what your book's really about, is not solved through material means. And I think we fully, I know we have not fully come to grips with the transformation of the American family, the change of the pace of economic change that you emphasized a minute ago, which I think is important. And I think we're going to struggle to figure it out. But that's what's on the table.
I agree with that. I agree that everything I suggested is Band-Aids. I mean, I'll go. I will stand up for free healthcare. I just think it's the one thing I can tell. The few times political consultants has ever reached out to me based on the findings of my book, I say, look, the only thing I really hear about every day from people out there is healthcare. It's the political issue that if somebody quote solves it, they're going to get elected. But going back to, I don't know how to change. I don't know how to fix anything. I mean, I don't know how to do anything beyond Band-Aids. The example I use is when I was a kid, the town I grew up in, or the town next to I grew up in, was a classic industrial town. It had 2 orange juice factories. And there was a family there that owned the orange juice factory, or I don't remember, they were sole owner or part owner of the orange juice factory, and they owned a lot of land. We knew the family was well off, but I went to public high school with the kids, right? I ended up finding out that the family was somewhere in the Forbes 500 eventually, which I had no idea of. They didn't act like it. They lived as part of the community. That is no longer the case. That's
rare.
And
Warren Buffett is a rarity. Lives in the quote normal house.
I don't know, but this family was part of the community at every level. Yeah. They didn't go to Africa to have hunting trips. So, they just were part of the family community. I don't know how you can't legislate that. You can't, through politics, create a culture where the people who run the capital, the people who run the markets, who are involved in the markets, feel an obligation to the rest of the community, or feel that, value the employees in a way the more than the market does. I don't know how you enforce that. That just was it was considered louche behavior in the past, and people did it less than they do it now. So I think a lot of it was, again, the people who ran that orange juice factory lived in the town. That orange juice factory was eventually bought by a Brazilian conglomerate and then moved away. So I think local ownership makes a big difference. I don't have a policy solution of how to change that.
But I think the solution ultimately, I think it's a mistake to look for a policy solution. I think that's where the light is, so that's where we look. I think the way this gets solved is the way it unraveled. We're not going to put it back together. The way it unraveled is that, to some extent, is that social norms of what's acceptable and unacceptable changed. To give your argument its best due, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and they can change again. People can be ashamed of going to that safari in Africa as a winter break activity rather than proud of it. You could be ashamed owning a $500,000 car rather than not. And we don't know how to create culture and norms. So it's, I recently talked to Mary Hirschfeld about this in an episode about Aquinas and the market. So we're doing right now. This is a very small step about what we think is admirable versus what is not so admirable. And I think it's not going to fix anything, but it maybe makes a difference.
Right. I guess I would say where I differ from you and where I differ from a lot of people on the libertarian right, and I'm not going to just pigeonhole you in that camp, is I think the centrality of the market, making the market central to everything, often I think its natural endpoint is kind of where we are, which is, as a trader for 30 years or 20 years, I kind of ended up viewing markets as always ending up in kind of a winner take all direction if they aren't more carefully monitored. And I know that's very, very that's the antithesis of your views in some ways. But I think the problem is we've put the market at the center of everything, and when you do that, that ends up eroding those norms we've talked about.
But Chris, who's we? I mean, I don't do that even, and I'm as free market as anybody. I think I know.
We as a culture. I don't mean.
Where's it come from? Who thinks that's a good idea? And where does it manifest itself? In fact, there's so many places where we all agree that it shouldn't become first, that it isn't the only thing. And yet somehow I think that's too easy a way to blame where we got to. I think it's so much more complicated. I think the death of the family like it's already dead. It's close.
But you don't think that some of that, the death of that family is when we view things only in the material, thinking it's only in terms of markets. I mean, look. I don't. But go ahead. Tell me why. I'm not. I don't know if I should. I'm just thinking out loud here.
Yeah, me too. I'm not. I don't have an answer.
I think what frustrates me is I think I look back at how we put Wall Street central, and I mean we, meaning the elites, in the sense that my party with Clinton basically sold out to industry and banking somewhere in the post Reagan revolution. And I think when it did that, the sense of the utilitarian dominating everything, and then utilitarian given over to efficiency and GDP growth, kind of dominated policy for the next 30, 20, 25 years. I don't think that had to happen. I think if the Democrats had stayed as in opposition to big business, it might have slowed the process down. Now, the other alternative is they might have kept losing and it would have actually sped it up. So,
but it wasn't a strategic calculation. It was basically, I think the incentives on both parties are to coddle Wall Street. And my joke is both parties like to give money to their friends. They just have different friends, but they have one friend in common, and that's Wall Street.
I think that's very true.
They both, unfortunately, take care of it, and it does have terrible costs, and I think it's been a incredibly destructive 30, 40 years of bailouts and special breaks, and it's horrible. And we're on the same page there, interestingly. But I think what I wanted to suggest, though, on this question of, quote, markets, I don't think there's anything inherently destructive that almost all Americans can have a cell phone. Almost all Americans can have inexpensive clothing. Almost all Americans have incredible access to food. These are changes that nobody planned, nobody put in motion through policy. They happen because we let them happen. And most of them have been good. Now, what you're chronicling is the downside. And I think where I will criticize my free market side is saying, my side pretends it doesn't even exist. My side pretends, yeah, everybody's better off. My side pretends, yeah, it's efficient. My side pretends, oh, well, they'll all find new jobs. The markets are dynamic. And your book is a reminder that it's not true. And I don't want to minimize, not just that. I think what you've chronicled here is deeply important. And I think this is what, if you're a caring person and you don't just care about who wins elections or whether your tribal side is triumphing in every 4 years, I think we need to think about these problems in a different way than just, well, they just need a tax break in that neighborhood, says the free market side. Or, well, they just need more welfare payments if you're on the interventionist side. I think we got to get out of that box.
I agree with that. And I would say that one of the things I said, one of the smart quips, one of my quips about 4 years ago on Twitter, what I said was when I was trying to poke that kind of mentality was, I said, maybe, look, my dad was a historian, my brother's a historian. I recognize by historical standards, we're very fortunate. But I always say is like, maybe people don't want 2 iPhones. Maybe they want 1 iPhone and 3 friends, So I think we tend to look at all these problems as where I think my book has resonated on the right, even though I'm a leftist, is the part you're getting to that I'm kind of deflecting, which is the book is a lot about, it's not just a material gap that people are experiencing, it's a spiritual gap. There's a whole void there that's not just about things. And
yep.
As you said, it's pretty clear it's not about things. People have more things now than ever. It's about, and so that's kind of why one of the things I've always said is one of my frustrations with the left and right in this world, both Marxists and capitalists, is they're 2 sides of the same coin where that coin is the material. That's all they think about. One is how do we have more material stuff, and the other is how do we redistribute the material stuff we have. And when I think, again, this is why I don't offer policy solutions in my book, is like, because it's so much bigger than that. The problem is that's the only coin, that's the only axis we're thinking about. We're not thinking about all the other axes that are orthogonal, the other axes of meaning that are orthogonal to that. Faith, place, identity. Those things value people. And I think that's where a lot of the loss is centered. That because we only think about things, we've devalued the spiritual, and I don't mean that only in religious sense, side of the equation. The intangible, there you go. And I think that's where the solution is, but I don't know, and this is where I agree with you. There's no policy to get there.
We'll get there on our own, because that's what we do, I hope. You'll like this line. I wrote an essay recently on inequality, and I said, there's no variable for dignity in the data set, so we just ignore dignity. And I think,
wow, there you go.
The title of your book, Dignity, is a very appropriate. You could have called it a lot of different things. That's a beautiful title because it's really what it's about at the root. That the people you're talking to and photographing, and we didn't mention this, but they're not candid photographs. They're really beautifully posed portraitures of people in these neighborhoods. They're extraordinary. That you took with their permission and their pride and dignity in tough situations. But we don't have that variable, so we tend to ignore it. And so the left and the right focus on the monetary and the material, and that we fight about inequality and how important it is and how to, quote, fix it, when we ought to be thinking about dignity is, I think, the central issue of the next few years in our culture and our politics. But I want to close with a chapter of your book that we haven't talked about yet, which you've taken us to naturally, which is religion. You spent your Sundays on these tours in small churches in very tough neighborhoods. You write beautifully, and I have this image. It almost makes me sweat just thinking about the folding chairs and the fans, unair conditioned, and nothing fancy about these institutions. They're storefronts. They're beat up buildings. There's a lot of photographs of them in the book. Talk about what you saw in those churches and how it changed you.
Right. I mean, the quip I use is I walked into the Bronx, a vegetarian atheist, and now I'm a meat-eating agnostic who goes to church pretty regularly.
And what do your physics buddies think of them?
Exactly. What would they think of them? They're again, I think they try to get where I'm coming from, but it's not clear. The way I think about faith initially was I had to put my scientific hat on, which is I was seeing in these communities, like I saw McDonald's being used, one of the few places that functioned and provided people a space with the churches. And so it wasn't just a space; they provided them dignity, actually. And not only that, but they accepted them on their terms. There was no barrier to entry. You could just walk in, and you found people who were like you. The secular world, the cold secular world I'm part of, just provides you dreary institutions that you have to work through like a maze, and that are dehumanizing and have no soul. So I couldn't deny initially the value of religion, just simply as utilitarian value. And so, that's where I shifted initially. And then as I spent more and more time, I realized it wasn't just, this is where I am now. It's pretty arrogant of me to say it simply as a utilitarian thing, because it's more than that. Maybe people are not using them just for utilitarian purposes, but because their situation provides them with an opportunity to understand things better than I understand them. The way I think about it is I always think about mathematically, often you learn about a problem. If you want to understand a problem, you push it to its boundary condition, and things become more clear at the boundary conditions. And in many ways, what I was seeing was people at their boundary conditions. And here, faith was essential. And so maybe it wasn't just utilitarian. Maybe what they were seeing was faith as the truth. And it was my situation, and our elite, being an elite who had everything under control, who was removed from the evidence for faith. So I started realizing that, there was a lot more going on than I had been willing to admit. And it goes back a little bit to that same question we were talking about earlier about you kind of dismiss it because you can't measure it. You certainly can't measure faith, in my opinion. So we dismiss it entirely. But that, I think we're very wrong to do that.
It reminds me of the episode we had with Ian McGilchrist talking about left side, right side of the brain ways of perceiving the world. And in his view, one side, the left side's very analytical, narrow, narrative-based, easily finds things to fit the narrative. The right side of the brain is more holistic, humble, less confident, less focused. And your book, to my reading, to some extent, is an application of that coming from the physics Wall Street background that you grew up in and were an adult in for most of your life, you had closed off. He used the example of the bird looking with one eye very carefully at the seed to make sure that you don't pick up a pebble with the seed. With the other eye, which connected to the opposite side of the brain, you're looking for predators. The whole picture is available to you. And so when you get trained in physics in Wall Street, kind of focused on the seed. And you're now a little bit more open to the wider range of stuff, not just predators, but other stuff. It's really, it's incredible honesty. It's brave to write it on your part.
I think Yeah, I mean, it's just, like I said, I think the sitting behind a wall of computers, building mathematical models is fun. Believe me, I did it. And I still think that way many times for 40 years. But it's also, I think, far more narrow-minded than we who do it like to admit. You know, I know, I guess the way I frame it to my science friends is like, look, I got a PhD in physics. I understand the Big Bang as well as, you know, I think a lot of people do. I understand the theory.
It's a small group. When you say a lot of people, you mean of the people who understand it.
Right. I mean, I don't understand. I mean, it's been 20 years, but I can pick up a book and figure it out, and remember it. But the point being is, I say to them, I say, look, science is great at building bridges. It's not so clear to me it's good at building meaningful lives. And so, you know, the metaphysical answers that come from science are not any deeper in my mind than the answers that came before it. It's just a big metaphor at some level, a mathematical metaphor. But I think there's a lot to be said for. I wish there was a lot more humility within the scientific community for what we can't know and what we will never know, and understanding that. And I think the people who are living on the streets, who are addicts, who've been through a lot, not only understand that we're all sinners and we're all fallible, and we need to embrace the concept of forgiveness, but also that there are just things just too big to understand, and that we may never understand, and that we really don't have this all under control. And accepting that is really hard for a scientist to do, because we are trained to think with just enough time and enough smarts and enough money, we can figure it out.
You become a little more skeptical about that.
Oh, definitely. I think I would go so far as to say I'm sure, you know, I get a little more philosophical, but I think there are some things that we may just have to accept we'll never figure out. And in that sense, that's where the role of faith is.
So you talked about that in the book, and just now. I'm curious. Let's close with you. If you want to say anything about other ways that this experience transformed you. It's at you know, some people after 20 years on Wall Street get a really good therapist and are already going to one. You took a very unusual road of therapeutic treatment that I'm sure changed you in lots of ways. There are other ways you haven't talked about today that this book transformed you. And do you have any idea of what you're going to do next with your life? Given that new perspective, if I'm right, that you have one.
The new perspective is effectively, I mean, to put it in kind of PowerPoint presentation form, data bad, talking to people good. So the qualitative over the quantitative. But it also reinforces the view I had before to some degree, but now I really truly believe in is before you pass judgment on anybody, or especially if you pass judgment on a group, walk a mile in their shoes, or at least walk with them a mile in their shoes. You know, I think we've kind of become, I don't want to use a buzzword, a cliche that sounds very political, but we've kind of, the secular elite has kind of lost touch with so much. It's not because of bad intentions, in my view. I don't want to say that. It's just they're very well intended. That's the frustrating thing, is they have the best intentions in mind. But I think that they've become, I put myself in that camp, have become so detached from the people we claim to be advocating for. How has it changed me in different ways? It's made it harder to go to New York City and hang out on Wall Street. It just feels very foreign. It feels like it just feels so removed from what and in that case, it's very frustrating because it's unfair to the people who are working as bankers now to feel kind of detached and angry at them at some level. It's not their fault. They're good people. I just feel like I just want to shake them and say, there's this whole part of the country that you guys aren't seeing. In terms of next projects, the place I feel like I'm most uncomfortable intellectually is that what we were talking about at the end about faith versus science. And so consequently, that's where I kind of want to go next, to spend some time in a small community, kind of just documenting different congregations, and not just spending a week or two, but spending 6 or 7 months and trying to understand better the role of faith in our society.
My guest today has been Chris Arnade. His book is Dignity, and I think it's going to shake a few of those bankers up if they take a look at it, and the rest of us. Chris, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you very much for having me again.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.